Of a very special shiur today in honor of Yonah, the advent of a very special day on the Jewish calendar, historically, 19th of Kislev, which we're going to explore a little bit of the history of it, even into the modern era. I apologize if you might hear some noise in this video, because there is construction, Baruch Hashem, the building of the land of Israel outside my door, especially in the system of Kavod Habrios. We have to make sure that everybody has what they need so that the plumbing will function. If you don't have plumbing, you don't have Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. So there you go. We're gonna share also a remarkable shot, because the 19th of Kislev, which begins this evening, also we have a Torah reading that is precisely Shlishi of Parsha Yosef, which is spot on the sale of Yosef, and we'll analyze a pasuk there that I think will be completely mind-boggling in terms of a special insight. So we want to do a little historical overview of 19th Kislev, what its significance is to many people in the world, including pretty much the world of Hasidim at large, and those who are interested in the world of Hasidim, and then also some special Divrei Torah that would be relevant, and also the unique day of 19th Kislev and how it relates to a very significant event by none other than President Donald J. Trump, has a unique and special connection to the 19th of Kislev that you won't believe. So we're going to see that too. So let's begin. What happened on the 19th of Kislev? So a couple of historical events. First of all, it was the birth of the Maggid of Mezrich. He was the architect of Hasidus. He was the person who literally set up the nascent leadership. He assembled the great minds and hearts, including the Baal HaTanya, Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, who had become the author of Tanya, one of the seminal books of Hasidus. And which explains its theological and philosophical foundations, and also the author of Shulchan Aruch Harav, a monumental halachic work, which was meant to be sensitive to the emerging world of Hasidim, and give them their own halachic text that would be authoritative, which is also remarkable. It's regarded in all camps as a masterful Hasidic work. So those two great masterpieces were authored by Shneir Zalman, and at the behest of his Rebbe, the Maggid of Mezrich, whose yortzeit is the 19th of Kislev. So that's number one, so to speak. They both had monumental events. What was that? That in 1798, it was November 16th, 1798, the Tsar ordered that Reb Shneir Zalman and all the Hasidim would be freed from arrest, and they had been arrested, and this was the charges against them were brought by, of course, challenges within the Jewish community itself. So how appropriate that we juxtapose Mechiras Yosef and Yutes Kislev, because essentially it sparks the idea of a major philosophical and theological and social and unfortunately dangerous conflict, as all conflicts between Jews are, that took place all the way back to the sale of Yosef. Similarly, on the 19th of Kislev, opponents of Hasidus had made a petition to the Tsar, inviting that not so illustrious representative of Esav. I just saw that there was an amazing Jewish one Jew who destroyed the Tsarist regime almost single-handedly many years later in the times of World War I, when there was the Sino-Russian War. I think that was around 1906, and the Tsar at the time needed a tremendous amount of money, billions of today's dollars, to fight against the rather sophisticated Russian Tsarist army. And who provided the money? A Jew named Schiff, who came from a small community, a ghetto actually in Germany, and he was associated with the Rothschild family, and he was devastated at how, uh, starting with the late 1800s in particular, the tremendous suffering of the Jewish people, which really began in the early 1800s, but culminated with the vicious riots and persecutions under the Tsarist regime that went on from the 1820s all the way through the 1880s. It was mamish impossible, which really is what caused mass immigration out of Russia to America, believe it or not. But as vengeance against the Tsarist regime, this banker named Schiff loaned a huge amount of money to the Japanese banker, the Japanese banker who was procuring weapons of war for the Emperor of Japan, and he said, "This is going to stick it to the Tsar." So you have one Jew, a Yosef Atzadik figure, a banker, who had all the money in the world, like Yosef collected all the money in the world and put it under his storage. Well, you had the Rothschilds and this Jew, Jacob Schiff. I think his name was Jacob Schiff. The Maram Schiff, who's a very, very well-known Achron commentator on the Talmud, was his descendant, and I think he was an observant Jew too, this fellow, and he almost single-handedly punished the Tsar for the terrible anti-Semitism, but it goes all the way back. And so here, all the way back in 1798, the Baal Shem Tov was accused of the following three charges. Number one, he was involved in rebellion and conspiracy. Number two, his companions were accused of leading a life of lawlessness, meaning that they had their own laws. Three, they were branded thieves and bribe takers. So the biggest suspicion was the fact that of tzedakah was actually tzedakah. We know that it's so ironic, but as the will of Hashem was that the Vilna Gaon himself, whose adherents were the most vocal opponents of the Shneur Zalman, and may have been directly involved in these charges that were sent to the Tsar, that were then reacted to. They themselves understood that it was time to return to the land of Israel, and that return was going to begin with the revelation of the Baal Shem Tov and of the Vilna Gaon concurrently in the early 1700s, 1733, 1740. In that area, it was already signaled that this is the year 5500, and we have to return to the land of Israel. It is Friday of the last millennium of creation. It was the midpoint of the final, the dawn, literally dawn of the final 500 years of potential Jewish history, which culminates with the year 6000, as represented by the Gemaras in Avodah Zarah and Gemara Sanhedrin and so on, and it's taught by the Vilna Gaon to his Talmidim, and he said we got to get the move on to Eretz Yisrael, which peaked around 1781, just a few short years before this event took place. So they were sending people back to Eretz Yisrael, and therefore people like the Alter Rebbe, Zechatzak Levacha, were collecting money in Europe to support the Jews who were traveling, trying to establish a life for themselves in the land of Israel. That community was the Hasidic part of it anyway. And if you know, in the old city, there's two major synagogues. One was renovated several years ago, and one was really just about finished. I don't know if I've been inside it yet, but we all know the Chorva synagogue was, so to speak, the Litvish, or the non-Hasidic, the students of the Vilna Gaon being the ancestors that started that community going back to the 1700s, and had that synagogue up until 1948, which then was destroyed by the Jordanians and restored not that many years ago. And then the Tiferes Yisrael synagogue, which was the Hasidic synagogue, to which not the Tsar, but we know the head of the Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, Franz Joseph, who had his empire up until World War One, and then he came to Jerusalem in 1869 after witnessing the opening of the Suez Canal, and he had a big taiva to come to Israel. All major monarchs and countries want to have a piece of Eretz Yisrael and a piece of Yerushalayim, but he actually donated the roof to to this synagogue, which has just been completed recently. I don't know, many of you may have gone there, but that was the Hasidic hub of the old city. So here we had these dual, so to speak, communities living side by side in the old city, but the source of the funding came from Europe all the way back, and that's Kolel Chabad, by the way, or Meir Baal HaNes charities. That goes all the way back to then. All right, so, but they were able to suggest that since the Ottoman Empire at the time were the titular owners of Eretz Yisrael, and they were the mortal enemies of the Russian Tsar. They were competing empires, right? Then how could it be that the Alter Rebbe was sending money to support Jews who lived under the jurisdiction of his enemies, the Ottoman rule? And that was an argument that this was rebellion and insurrection. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. It was stuck. But in September 15, 1798, Rav Shlomo Zalman, the Alter Rebbe Zatzal, was arrested with his books, papers, and taken to St. Petersburg during that first week of October of 1798, and he remained in prison until the interrogation finished, having seen that there was absolutely no grounds for any of the accusations. He defended himself as follows on the main points of the interrogation. Number one, that Hasidism did not mean to start a new religion. The Tsar could only recognize old religions. Judaism was a recognized religion, but people accused him of starting a new religion. And he said, no, it's just restoring some of the ancient customs of prayer and kavana, love and awe, which were neglected over the years, and now it was reclaiming the ancient traditions of prayer and devotion to Hashem that had become lax in the last generations, but it was nothing new. On finances, he denied any wrongdoing. He said he had a modest source of income, which was his wife's tavern and a grain business and a small stipend as a Rebbe. So he certainly wasn't funding major money, but on the foreign connections. But he said that this money that he sent to the land of Israel was part of a very widespread ancient fundraising effort, claiming Israel was limited to issuing request letters. He said, I never administered any funds and I never sent funds, but I issued letters of appeals, like many rabbis did. Given that they even have two famous stories during his imprisonment. One was that the Tsar himself disguised himself and wanted to see who this man was. And then he walked into his prison cell, and Reb Shlomo Zalman stood up immediately and said, "You like your honor, your majesty, whatever it might be." And the Tsar was shocked that he understood that who he was, even though he was in this disguise. Another one is that one of his interrogators said, what does it mean, ayeka? How could it be that it says in Parshas Bereshis that Hashem asks Adam HaRishon, where are you? Doesn't Hashem, or the all-knowing God, know where Adam HaRishon is? And this troubled him. And the answer that he responded was, this is not a question that God asked that man. It's a question that God asks everyone, every living human being. Where are you holding? You have to be asking yourself. One of the questions that he asked people to ask themselves was to self-evaluate. Yeka, where are we holding in life? Are we fulfilling our mission? Are we fulfilling our tachlis? Are we fulfilling our potential in the service of Hashem? And so those two stories are kind of, I would say, symbolic. Why? What do I mean? Because you have one encounter. I think both of those. I think the first encounter was certainly with the Gentile, meaning the Tsar. The second encounter is not so clear who the interrogator was, but it seems to be a Gentile, but it's quite possibly someone who wanted to understand the Torah. So the issue here was twofold. Number one, we want to understand the concept of of a Jewish tzaddik, of the idea that a Jew could be a source, a wellspring of wisdom for the entire world, not just for his own inner community, but could touch the lives of so many other people and would have what to share. We know that the successive Rebbes of Chabad, specifically the last Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, of blessed memory, who passed away in 94, and many of us were privileged to meet, including myself, that he often spoke to Gentiles and critically about morality, about the seven Noahide mitzvos as a basic human foundation for morality. So that first encounter with the Zohar really is symbolic of that, how shall I say, unusual or new, I wouldn't say new, but I would say renewed shlichus, that the Jews would finally be entering an era in which they could speak to the Gentile world. Remember, emancipation had already happened in 1740. There was Napoleonic Wars that went on exactly at that time, 1799, and the world was opening up, maybe frighteningly so, and very, very quickly to the Jewish world. The Jewish world was opening and being exposed to the Gentile world, and there needed to be a way to present authentic Judaism as a positive, in a positive sense, and as a constructive sense, and as a force for stability, peace, honesty, morality, values. So that encounter with the Tsar very, very, very has set a tone for what the difference would be in Jewish world when we cross that Rubicon of the period of time in which essentially the hidden parts of Torah opened almost fully. What I mean to say is that Hasidus dared to pull the veil against basic ideas within the Kabbalah, as did the Vilna Gaon in his teachings. He wrote the commentaries to all of the major Kabbalah Svarim, from whether it was Sefer Hayetzira, which was attributed to Rishon, whether it was Sifrit Tzniusa, the central part of the Zohar, which speaks of the 6,000 years of world destiny. There was a how shall I say, a renewed public interest, which always was throughout the centuries, but kind of exploded open in the mid 1700s, as the world was going a major change. Think of American Revolution, French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, the opening of the ghettos, the Jewish mass migration from Russia to America, and the nascent communities in Israel starting to gain a little bit of traction. There's so much going on at that time, so that it's the story of the 19th of Kislev was taken by the Hasidim as a vindication that they had every right to spread the teachings, and that's the famous teaching that they say, that the Baal Shem Tov saw the neshama of Mashiach, and the Mashiach, he asked him, when are you coming? And of course, he said, when your teachings will pour out like a fountain, your mayanot would go chutza. Agav, I'm going to tell you a very, very fascinating story. There is a yeshiva called Mayanot in Jerusalem, which is celebrating a brand new build today, as we speak, at 1 p.m. They started a dedication ceremony of this massive, gorgeous, multi-million-dollar yeshiva for Bali Tshuva in the heart of Jerusalem, not far from Mila Mall, and my wife is there. Now, why is my wife there? Because my brother-in-law, God bless him, from Miami, Florida, from Hollywood, Florida, is an honored guest. Now, why is he an honored guest? Because the benefactor of this yeshiva and community, I'm not going to mention his name publicly, but it's public knowledge, a gentleman who was a surgeon and brilliant man and brilliant businessman. They invested and created a $30 million business empire, but then fell into illness and needed caretaking. And my brother-in-law was engaged. He has a background in Hatzalah and all these kind of, medical stuff, rescue, and so on. They said, we need someone to watch him as his health is deteriorating greatly. And he actually helped him get to Eretz Yisrael, despite, incredible, incredible obstacles. The man wanted to emigrate to Israel. There were many obstacles financially, business-wise, opposition, other parties involved in his money and his interests, and it was big, big problems. And somehow, miraculously, right here on Yud-Tes Kislev, this man escaped the confines of America and was able to make Aliyah. And he's sitting in his suite in Jerusalem today, a kind of a Yud Tes today, tonight being Yud Tes Kislev. And on the eve of Yud Tes Kislev, he's celebrating his Aliyah and the dedication of this magnificent building and the dedication of his many, many, many millions of dollars to promote exactly what the Mashiach, soul of Mashiach, told Baal Shem Tov, according to the Baal Shem Tov, was Mayanot. We're going to send out your teachings outwardly, and that is what's going on today. And my wife will bring back a full report, and so will my brother-in-law. But it's also another important symbolic thing. So, what else happened? As I mentioned, on the 17th of Kislev, the 19th of Kislev, we said the Maggid's yard site, the Maggid being the architect of these Mayanot, of these fountainheads to go outward. I mean, his selected group of Hasidim included Rabbi Melchel Lizensk and many others who were how shall I say, the foundation stone of this movement. Of course, the Rabbi Shlomo Zalman being, I would say the shining star of the group who produced these two seminal works. Not that the Rabbi Elimelech Sefer is also highly regarded, but it's a sefer that is written for the elite group of tzaddikim, whereas the Tanya is directed to the Beinoni, the everyman. Okay, but here's a connection to the sale of Yosef and Donald Trump. All right. On 19th of Kislev in 2017, Donald J. Trump made a proclamation as Jerusalem as the capital of the land of Israel. This took place, I guess, 8 years ago now. And this is what he said. And I'm going to read to you what he said. And I definitely think it's associated, by no accident. And we know that he visited the Lubavitch Rebbe's Zatzal's graveside at his campaign, as I've noted in my Shiurim, as we had watched the events around us, and I like to link them to what's going on in the Jewish world. From the moment that he visited, his campaign began to be matzliach. He was in no way a favorite to win the election, but there was a turning point. From the time that he went after that visit, somehow the polls and everything else started to go in his direction, and then you had the various problems on the Democratic side. Go figure. But here's what he said on Yud-Tes Kislev, 2017. President Donald J. Trump's proclamation on Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel. My announcement today marks the beginning of a new approach to the conflict between Israel and Palestinians. New approach. No more international city. When the state of Israel was voted into reality by the United Nations, not that it needed United Nations imprimatur at all, but it was voted into reality by Kadosh Baruch Hu as promises to Avram Avinu, but they had a plan that Jerusalem would be an international city. It would belong to no one and everyone. There would not be any dominion. It would be an international city, which is what Arabs really today still look at it as and hoping that it will be restored to. But at least it's better than having Israel control it. However, so he said, recognizing Jerusalem. On Yud-Tes Kislev 2017, Donald Trump followed through with his promise to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel and has instructed the State Department to begin to relocate the U.S. Embassy to Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which is something that we know he followed up on. There's a beautiful, beautiful, brand new U.S. Embassy to Israel, not far from Kever Rachel, by the way, which of course is appropriate to this week's parsha as well. Now, this is the wording. President Trump recognizes Jerusalem, the ancient capital of the Jewish people, as the capital of the state of Israel. So he's linking the idea of ancient Israel, ancient capital, meaning David HaMelech and the various Judean kings. In taking this action, President Trump filled a major campaign promise of his and many previous presidential candidates. It had been voted that way. This declaration was pending, had been passed in the 90s and kept being suspended year by year by year by various presidents until Trump allowed the security waiver to lapse and the law to go into effect. The idea of the embassy being in Yerushalayim had been legislated by Congress and by Senate by unanimous vote. I don't think that would happen anymore, by the way, ironically. It happened 5 years ago. I don't believe it would happen anymore. That by 100-0, the United States voted to acknowledge that the embassy of the United States should go to Jerusalem. And this was the Jerusalem Recognition Act of 1995. Okay. And fine. President Trump recognizes that the status of Jerusalem is highly sensitive, but he does not think the peace process is aided by ignoring the simple truth that Jerusalem is home to Israel's legislature, Supreme Court, president, prime minister, etc. And then he goes on to say, how it's going to play out in terms of the peace agreements. But as we know, those are high and mighty ideas that we haven't seen materialize quite yet, and hopefully will not see it in the form that's currently proposed. Let's move on then. So let's see. We know that the stories of Yosef are always intertwined, also with the month of Kislev and the holiday of Hanukkah. But I want to take a particular look at the sale of Yosef for a moment. Let's begin a little bit of analysis from the parsha to gain a humongous insight about what the sale of Yosef really is all about. Okay, they might not have thought of. So back to the beginning of the parsha. It's the Torah tells us, "Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz migurei aviv be'eretz Canaan." Elah told us Yaakov Yosef. Now we know that Yaakov worked 20 years to produce Shvatim. He produced 11, and then he risked running away from Lavan rather than staying in Chutz La'aretz to have a 12th child, and that 12th child was born just on the outskirts of Eretz Yisrael, just on the outskirts of Beit Lechem. So we say here the following. Listen to the pasuk. Elah told us Yaakov Yosef ben Shva Esrei Shana. Okay, if you're telling me he's told us, why don't you mention the other sons? And also, why mention his age? Why is his age important? Why is his age important? Well, maybe because of the story of the sale. But it says, Hayaroa es echav batzon. Well, let's break this down language-wise. Hayaroa es echav batzon. To me, what this says is that he was shepherding his brothers as sheep, yet he was only 17 years old. And this would explain, Mefarshim deal with this pasuk is a very, very difficult pasuk. Some Mefarshim cut it, slice it, dice it, change the order. I'd like to suggest a simple reading of it. As it says, he was only 17 years old. He was considered the primary tribe of all the tribes, and he was delegated by his father to be the roet son, which meant his brother, supervise his brothers in the way they handled the sheep, but also shepherd his brothers. He was shepherding his brothers. V'hunar. One of the things he did, and that was despite his youth, and Rashi, when Chazal say here that he made himself look attractive and beautiful, well, if you want to be a leader and you want to find favor in people's eyes, you shouldn't neglect your, and whatever appeal you have, you can draw. He wanted himself to look appealing to his brothers so he could be mashbiya on them. And then it says, Es b'nei Bilha, v'hunar, es b'nei Bilha, es b'nei Zilpa, nishei aviv. What happened to Leah? Vayavei Yosef is diba samra lavihim. No mention of the children of Leah. So what does this mean? There were only 4 Shvatim that were the children of Bilha and Zilpa. right? Gad and Naphtali and Asher, correct? And and who else do we have? Dan. So what Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. So like what happened to the rest? And Vayave Yosef is dibatam ra elavim. Who are we talking about? So the simple pshat in the pasuk is going on the B'nai Zilpah, or is there another statement? So let's look at the pasuk more comprehensively now. Hayeroes echav batzon is everybody, all of his brothers. And I'll prove it to you from the Medrash, because the Medrash says that the report that he brought back was not only about those four, but about the other brothers too. So let's assume echav in the broader reading. But when it came to the four sons of the Shvatim, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, who na'ar, he made himself pleasing to them. He didn't have to do that for his other brothers. Nar means he put on a little, he made himself look nice. He washed his face, he put on nice clothes, he put on a little coloring, a little hairstyling. He wanted to be their, how shall I say, their big brother, beloved big brother. He didn't try to do that for the other brothers. Why was he doing this to Bill and Zilpah? And what does it mean, Nishei Aviv? Don't I know that it's Nishei Aviv? So here's the critical point. Yosef, like Yaakov, understood that this was a group of 12. Okay? Not subdivided into hierarchies. And the only person who could be trusted and secure the legacy of Yaakov, that there would be 12 tribes of equal, I'm not saying equal stature, but of equal importance as part of an undeniable and inseparable part of Klal Yisrael was Yosef. And to that extent, he was Makarev, B'nai Bilhan, B'nai Zilpah, Nishei Aviv, because in reality, they weren't wives, you could argue, they were slaves. They were the slaves. Bill and Zilpah were the slaves of Rachel and Leah, and therefore their children should have been considered slaves. And indeed, that's what Chazal suggests, and Meforshim suggest that these six sons of Leah treated the four sons of the Shvachos, as slaves. They did not see them as peers or equals. Neither would they accept the preeminence of Yosef, son of Rachel, and the young Binyamin, who was a non-factor at that time. He was the youngest. Remember, Yosef was born prior to the 6 years of service that Yaakov added, the last 6 of the 20 years of service that Yaakov did for his wives to Lavan. And Binyamin is born after that. So Binyamin is born in year 21. And at that point, Yosef is minimally 7 years old. Okay? So if Yosef's 7 years old, he's only 17 now, then his brother Binyamin hasn't even reached bar mitzvah. So he's a non-factor. He's really a non-factor. The others are considerably older, having been born in the years prior to the birth of Yosef. Remember, the first 7 years that Yaakov was by Lavan, he was not married. The second 7 years, he had all 4 wives and produced 11 sons. Okay, in the second 7 years. But in the last 6 years, he had no children. Okay, and only Binyamin, the final one of the Shvatim, being born in year 21, when they were all older than 17, with the exception of Binyamin, who is now at this advent no more than 10 years old. No more than 10 years old. Okay. Actually, what I would say even better, to be clear, Yosef again was born prior to the 6 years, so he's 7 when Yaakov leaves, and then Binyamin is apparently born just around the time when Yosef is 7. So now we can only project that he was not older than 10 years old. Okay, that's our calculation. Now, but if he wants to be close, then why does it say Vayave Yosef as dibasam ra elavihem? It's not going back on the B'nai Zilpah and B'nai Bilha. It's going back on the word Echav, the other brothers. And Rashi confirms this. Rashi says exactly that, quoting Chazal. Kol ra'o shahayaro be'echav b'nei Leah. He never brought any bad report about Dan Naphtali, Gad, and Asher because he was being makar of them because he wanted to show everyone that they were legit tribes, sons of Nishei Aviv. They weren't slave moms. But they were full wives. They were full wives with the understanding that Yaakov Avinu would not have relations with a slave woman, but rather had been encouraged by his two wives, Rachel and Leah, to elevate them to the status of wives. We call them pelagshim, but a pelagish, remember, is a wife just without a ksuba. So it's not that she's a Gentile, that they were Gentiles. They were not Gentiles. They were Jewesses. Okay, that's very important. That's what it means, Nishei Aviv. They can't be Nishei Aviv unless they would be legitimately Jewish because the Avos kept the mitzvahs. Now, what was the problem with the six tribes? It could only be something that wasn't just Stam Lashon Hara. It had to be, remember, according to the principles of the Chafetz Chaim, if you have an issue which is critical or dangerous, then there's a mitzvah called Lo Sa'amod al Dam Riecha. You cannot stand by and let other people's blood be spilled. Standing by and allowing there to be a distinction between the four of Dan Naphtali, Gad, Asher and the six sons of Ruvain is not allowed, and you could argue that he felt whatever he was saying by accusing of the six brothers of distancing themselves from the four or the other four was a necessary report because his ultimate objective, as he understood from his father, was to keep the unified unit of 12 Shvatim. Follow me? So he had to intervene if there was anything going on that threatened that. And what was going on that threatened that precisely? So, because I'll tell us here something unusual, but let's look at it a little bit more deeply. They were tearing limbs from animals and eating it. Strange. They were calling the other four sons slaves, as we just said. They seemed to be carrying on relations that didn't look kosher. But the reality is that they weren't doing anything wrong. It just Yosef perceived it as wrong. But that's because they each had a legitimate way of looking at things. Why was Yosef? What were the punishments of Yosef? Avram and Achai, they tore his jacket and said he was torn and they put blood of a goat. He was torn like a goat, so to speak, at least presenting his famous coat of many colors, his pasim coat. And Yaakov said, Taraf Yosef. Yosef was torn apart. That corresponds to the accusation of Avram and Achai, calling their brothers slaves. Le'evan nimkar Yosef. Yosef himself was sold as a slave. V'al ha'arayas shesiper alehem, and that there was a issue of sexual morality. He himself was involved in a terrible, terrible problem with Eishes Adonav, with the temptation of Eishes Potiphar. Okay, let's make sense of this. Either Yosef's right or wrong. Why does he get punished? Okay, if he's justified in bringing the reports, so why should he be punished? And let's understand why in the world would the Achim do what they did? So let's posit that the six brothers assumed that they were the quote-unquote legitimate six tribes. They admitted the idea of 12 tribes, but not that the other six would be on the same status because they would be born of the non-primary wife. In essence, the six was a compromise that had to deal with the absence of Esav in the role of creating Shvatim. Ideally, there would have been 6 Shvatim from Esav, 6 Shvatim from Yaakov. There would be 6 Shvatim that, were Ish Sadeh, and 6 more of a spiritual Shvatim, and that's it. And that's it. And the world of the 12 tribes would have gone accordingly. Yaakov was forced by the absence of Esav in this process to assume the Bechorah, to marry both of the wives, and produce all 12 himself. But the six sons of Leah said, "We are the real Klal Yisrael. Esav is the ancillary part of Klal Yisrael. We are the prime cut. We are the children of the real wife of Yaakov, Leah, who would later be buried in Maras Machpelah. Now you understand why in this week's Parsha, Ruvain goes out of his way to take Bilhah out of the tent of Yaakov, or Yaakov out of the tent of Bilhah, whichever way you want to look at it. It's a question what exactly happened. And because he's saying, no, Bilhah is associated with Rachel. She is not the first wife, as much as Yaakov treated Rachel as such and gave Bilhah, who was the maid of Rachel, that preeminence. It's really wrong because theologically, reality-wise, destiny-wise, zechus-wise, merit-wise, statute-wise, the six sons of Leah are the cream of the crop. And they will produce the leadership of Klal Yisrael, starting with Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. Okay? So the sons would argue, listen, Leah's argument is in the end of the day, it was me. And if it was the end of the day, it's me, it means I'm the one who's Yaakov's wife. And you, Rachel, were meant to be for Esau. In fact, Rashi echoes the fact that Rachel was in great danger. And she worried that because she didn't have any sons with Yaakov, that she would be relegated completely to the side of Esau. And that would have been her destiny. And that was a reality that was happening. In fact, Yosef himself shields his mother from Esav's vision when there's the encounter with Esav. And that is more than symbolic. It's because Yosef's existence was the antidote, or he's called Satano Shel Esav. He's the anti-Esav, as it were. And therefore, Esav is no longer, services in building Klal Yisrael are no longer required. Okay. But Yosef argued that there was no discrepancy between the children of Rachel and the Shvachos and the children of Leah. They were all on equal footing, which means that they had not yet ripened and matured into Klal Yisrael. There was going to be a bonding process. There was going to be a process by which they would be melded and trial by fire and in the Kur HaBarzel, in the searing heat of the Egyptian bondage, the greatness of the souls of the Jewish people would be forged anew, as if purged of any, like you purge metal of any what we call impurities. So you want pure gold, pure silver. You can't really get pure silver. You can get 929. I think you can get higher than 929. I don't even know. But you need a little alloy in there. Gold, maybe not. But the idea is it's a purification process of the souls of the Jewish people who had to go through some intense suffering and to be zoche, to be elevated to the level of a member of Klal Yisrael. Says Yosef, we are the 12 progenitors of the future Klal Yisrael. We're the prototypes, but we haven't reached the status of Klal Yisrael just yet. And therefore, you have no right to start practicing Jewish law in the land of Israel and say, we have arrived and here is our destiny. That was the mistake of the six sons of Leah. They said, look, we made it past Esav. We made it past Lavan. We're here in Eretz Yisrael. That's it. There was no need for further, how shall I say, refinement. We are here. We will grow in the land of Israel. We will eventually drive out the impurities within the land of Israel, and we are prepared for our destiny. Yosef said no. We all know that the Nevuah of Avraham Avinu was that there would be a 400-year smelting process, which the souls of the Jewish people will be forged from any previous sin. There are many opinions in the Zohar that the souls of the Jewish people were actually the souls of the Dor HaMabul, were actually the souls of the Tower of Babel. They needed to go through a tikkun, a big-time tikkun. The problems that started with Cain and Hevel needed to be reformed with the brothership of Moshe and Aaron. Yeah, it was going to take a while. And therefore, the laws of the seven Noahide laws were what was in force and not Kol Torah Kula, which was kept, but it wasn't yet in force. So therefore what? That meant that if you slaughtered an animal using the laws of Shechita by cutting the windpipe and the food pipe, majority of which, both, with a knife, which doesn't have imperfections, and the proper motion and proper position, that animal is considered halachically dead, and you may begin to chop off its limbs and consume them, because that's shechita. But if shechita doesn't yet exist, then we must wait for the death of the animal before you begin butchering. And it did not seem like the children of Leah thought that shechita was literally off the table, off the butcher block. They wanted to do shechita. They said, "We're holding by shechita. What do you want?" Whereas for a Noahide, if the animal's not quite finished twitching, okay, even though in the future it would be considered halachically dead and kosher, at that moment it was a problem of Aver Menachai. And that's the distinction. If you're a Noahide, wait. If you're a Jew, you don't have to wait. You performed the mitzvah of shlita. And at this point, the animal can then be butchered, meaning separated into different parts. But as Yosef says, don't you dare touch that animal until it is completely expired from all nerve movement and so on and so forth, any signs of life, because that's the understanding of what a Ben Noach would have to do. He says, you're not allowed to jump the gun. You're not allowed to go ahead of yourself. You cannot claim superiority and say, well, maybe my brothers are going to be Jews at some point, but right now we're the authentic Jews and we will behave as such. No. And there's hence the two dreams of Yosef to show his centrality as the leader were shared not so much because he was foolish or trying to boast, but he was making a case of something that everybody knew. Yosef argued his point. I've been tasked by my father to help us progress and survive through the gullus, which is inevitable. And they would say, we made it already. We don't need you, Yosef. Thank you very much, but we don't need you. In fact, we view you as a danger. We view you as such a danger that we're willing to excise you, and we'll take our chances on us developing additional tribes, and we'll get rid of you, which was the core argument of the sale of Yosef. They refused to acknowledge the other brothers as anything other than slaves. They refused to acknowledge that shechita was not yet an option for them. In terms of the women, so the Medrashim said that they were able to create women, or that they were, how shall I say, marrying women that would have been forbidden to them had they be a Ben Noach, but permitted to them as Jews. I'm not going to get into the exact circumstances, but it was also relevant to the idea that we've already reached this full status of Yisrael, that our father, who started as Yaakov and was promised to be Yisrael, were there, which they were not yet there. Okay, they would take the 400-year goals, which would be backdated to the birth of Yitzchak, to accomplish that, and Avram was already told that. Okay, so now I'll share with you, just by way of conclusion, what else was going on. This is absolutely mind-boggling, and we'll bring the whole thing together with the Yud Tes Kislev and everything else. You ready? Shlishi, which is tonight is Yud Tes Kislev. It says as follows: they sat down to eat after they stripped Yosef of his knonas pasim and threw him into a bore. Vayeshiv lechu lechem, vayisu einehem, vayiru v'hine. Here are visitors approaching. Now, if you think for a moment, for everybody who was excised from potential being part of Klal Yisrael, we had many people who wanted in, but were gently or more seriously removed. Who was removed? Let's go historically. Lot was removed. Eliezer, the servant of Avram, removed. Esav, removed, right? Who else was removed? There were um, Lavan was removed. Okay. And who else? Yishmael was removed. Follow me, right? So when they sold Yosef, they looked up and they saw a representative of each of these nations, as if to say, we're going to try to do the same thing to Yosef, except that Hashem wouldn't allow it to take place. Listen to this, it's mind-boggling. Vayiru Orchas Yishmaelim. So it was a band of slave traders, and they were Yishmaelites. Ba'a mi Gilad. Gilad was the place where he separated from Lavan. Ugamalehem nosim Gamalehem Gamalim. We associate with Eliezer Eved Avram, who took the 10 Gamalim, right, with him. Nosim Nechaos Vitsari Velot. They were carrying beautiful fragrance, but look, sorry. Nichaos actually kind of sounds like Noah, so that could go all the way back to Shem, Cham, and Yafes, and also Shem and Aver, who didn't quite make the cut of Klal Yisrael. Tsari, Ish, Tsar, V'oyev, that's Esav Haman. Valot, lotus, which is here, says the word lot, that's a reference to Lot. Holchim Lahorid Mitzrayma, on their way down to Egypt. Remarkable. In this one pasuk, you have a reference, a hidden reference to every single one of the, how shall I say, contenders to vie for the Birkas Avram, for representing to becoming the Jewish people, and yet only Yosef was the Tolda, and Hashem and the brothers said, let's try to get rid of him like we got rid of everybody else. We got rid of Yishmael, and we got rid of Lavan. Yishmaelim, Gilad, that's where we got rid of Lavan. Gemalim, that we got rid of Eliezer Avram. Nichaos, we got rid of the Noahides of Shem and Aver. Tsari, Ish Tsar of Haman, we got rid of the Amaleki, son of Esav. We got rid of Lot. Holchim Lot Mitzrayma. They're on the way to Egypt. They're out of Eretz Yisrael. So Yosef will be too. Ultimately, this pasuk reveals a tremendous secret, that the real issue of the sale of Yosef wasn't hatred and jealousy per se. It was a question of who was prepared to be the standard bearer of the name Yisrael. That Yisrael would actually be, as the Zohar Kodesh teaches, and I heard this originally from my predecessor, Rabbi Binyamin Blech, where I was the Rav Youngest of Oceanside after his tenure there. Yisrael contains all of the avos and imaos. Yud is Yitzchak and Yaakov. Sin is Sarah. Resh is Rivka and Rachel. Aleph is Avram. And Lamed is Leah. And there you have all of the avos. Yisrael is represented by the parents of all of the tribes, with the shvachos being included under Rachel and Leah. We need the totality of Klal Yisrael. And therefore, in order to have Yerushalayim, we need the Malchus of Yehuda together with the Malchus of Binyamin and Yosef. And that was declared on Yotes Kislev. And if we're going to have an era that's prepared for Mashiach and the reclaiming of Eretz Yisrael, we're going to need that special stepping up of the great tool of the Avos, prayer, charity, and a deep, deep, passionate connection to Hashem, which began to be revealed in that era of the original Yotes Kislev, with the birth of the Maggid, the death of the Maggid, and where both the Vilna Gaon and the Alter Rebbe both said there's going to be pathways to redemption, and they actually declared themselves Mashiach ben Yosef. It's unbelievable. So there you go. They are Mashiach ben Yosef, who's tasked with preparing the Jewish people for their journey back home. The Vilna Gaon, to clarity and clarification of each and every letter of the Torah and its halachic truth, through Chasidus, by refining the Jewish soul and elevating it so that the Panimius HaTorah will fire up our spirits. Shnei Or, Shnei Or means double light, the light of both Torah Shabbat, Torah Shosav and Baal Peh that was championed by the Vilna Gaon, and so enhanced also by the teaching of Chasidus, who opened up the hidden branches of Torah to every man, and that's what Yutes Kislev is all about. It's a really remarkable time. It's incredible that the declaration on Jerusalem happened historically on that day, and we shall see what the next declarations are. Hashem should give us on this day of confluence, where it all comes together. The identity of the Jewish people as the true heirs of Eretz Yisrael, as the true bearers of the message of Torah. We should elevate ourselves to be worthy of such and be optimistic that, as Yosef did, we will emerge triumphant from all the trials that we are currently experiencing. Have a great Yutes Kislev and have a great Shavua of Parshas Vayeshev.
It's